It is always an honor and a privilege on such a day when we celebrate things that have to do with the uniqueness of a woman. No doubt that many of us will celebrate because we have been ushered into this world by the unique giftings of a woman. And incredibly, we all give credence to the fact that women have a special place in our lives, in the day-to-day activities that they perform, way back from how they conceive us and how they nurture us, even when we're in their wombs, and even when they give birth to us. They are incredible beings who give a lot of protection to us because of the susceptibility of a child, perhaps because nature has authored it that way. Whether or not that is true or not, it's a question of debate. But I would like us to discuss a few things that are neglected many times of how many times women or the female being can sometimes take advantage of that privileged status that has been God endowed on them. And I would like to read from one of the things I captured in one of my books. The German writer called Esther Villa, in her book called The Manipulated Man. This book caused a lot of outrage and hostile criticism from women. And she tried to explain how women in the earliest times have actually manipulated men and turned them into what they call their slaves. So we become slaves of the female being. And she argues that they pretended to be oppressed, yet it is the man who is actually oppressed. And she explains how a woman manipulates a man skillfully by steps like courtship and finally marriage. And hence saying that a man chases a woman until she catches him. And in her book, she explains how the man is tricked to care for the woman in all his life and her offsprings. And he rows the strong like a Sisyphus, and in turn gets rewarded by a few minutes of what they call sexual pleasure. We can, in most cases, by observing what Esther Villa's assertions try to portray, that indeed sometimes a man can end up being a slave of the desires and that the woman uses or has used for thousands of years to keep what they call a stick and carrot, to keep the man chasing vanity and commits his life to serving her for the rest of her life. And she goes ahead to explain that the rivalry of women, for example, how each woman feels the powerful urge and the need to own a male for herself. Like a slave owner, he actually desists any move that a man would actually make to offer his services to another woman. And she uses all her means to keep the man to herself and her offsprings alone. And Esther Villa's sentiments are actually captured by the Nigerian poet and critic and also a writer called Chinzwezu Ibikwe in his book called The Anatomy of Female Power. And another book that probably would shed light is one by Willis Ferrells called The Predatory Female. And they all push for the theory that all societies are actually matriarchal and not patriarchal, as we are pushed and forced to believe. In fact, matriarchal has ruled, though not from brawn and wit, but tricks and trickery. as we have argued, or as Esther Villa tries to argue. Thus, the male becomes the most exploited when it comes in terms of sexual, pleasures over history of time. In terms of wars, man is always ready at all times to die for the woman, and he has been trained to do that from the moment of conception. In fact, Chin Chuezu calls the idea of dating and courtship training like that of a horse. It is during these times that a woman, having kept the man on a leash by denying him sex and getting him addicted to herself by false charms, trains and breaks him to whatever he wants him to become. So this idea of marriage as a celebration becomes a celebration for the woman and her friends, and they all congregate her or congratulate her for having succeeded in getting himself a slave. Think about that. So a man on that wedding day waves goodbye of his independence and of his coalition of males and commits himself to a sniffing life, rolling the stone, and therefore acting that he cannot abandon having a society or government checking on him and always ready to jail. And so we are shamed and exiled into these so-called absconding duties that are assumed because of that covenant of marriage. And the government makes sure that the woman is in control of this slavery of sorts. Shimskoezu gives a narration of how women are trained by order matriarchal to tame the men. He explains how a man is actually trained to rely on women by his own mother, and a man is shamed, for example, for cooking for himself and therefore doing other domestic chores by his own mother, who is an agent of what they call global matriarchal rule. Not to say that men don't do that, but the majority of men are perhaps trained that way. So by getting the man to hate these domestic works and having it enforced by culture, which warns men against doing kitchen stuff or even doing laundry. So the mother trains his own son for the woman who will actually captivate him. And when the time comes, she takes hold of the man's stomach by getting the man addicted to her body. She holds him, in real unity, as it were, even in terms of bedroom issues or kitchen issues. So those two weapons become manipulative in nature and therefore turn him into a plaything. So in the myth of male power, Esther Villas, a man's right to the other woman, he argues in terms of the polygamous sex. He says the authors of those books challenge the narrative that men oppress women, and by detailed research across Africa and even Western or even Eastern Africa or even ancient and modern societies, the authors unveil the hidden power of the ruthless matriarchal power that rules the world. And presidents and even emperors and kings are all puppets of these matriarchal forces that rule the world by pulling the strings from behind the curtains. So even as we celebrate this day of Women's Day, I'd like to congratulate the men for being perhaps honest slaves of that incredible, wonderful creature whom we call a woman. Power of a woman, not so. Be blessed as you enjoy Women's Day. That it was just food for thoughts without intention to hurt the incredible, wonderful creature called the female, who by all means in most cases is assumed to be more intelligently emotional than a man. So I understand that even by the very fact of speaking some of these things, they may cause some kind of, emotional distress, but consider that food for thought. For those of you who like doing a little bit of, substantive or critiquing of whatever notions or behaviors, whether cultural or religious or even otherwise. So be blessed and enjoy your day.